Hello, this Science of Sport video is for BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences, Unit 2 Functional Anatomy, and we are specifically looking at the respiratory system and the second part of 3 relating to the functions of the respiratory system. So it's for Learning Aim C2, functions of the respiratory system, and specifically we're looking at gaseous exchange. Now, there are 3 functions of the respiratory system based on your specification. One is mechanisms of breathing, which is a separate video. This video is looking at gaseous exchange, so the way in which we move oxygen and CO2 between 2 different locations. And then the third video in this sort of series about functions is about the lung volumes. So let's get going on gas exchange. Your specification requires you to know about these 2 aspects of gaseous exchange. Firstly, the percentages of CO2 and O2 that are in both inspired and expired air. And then secondly, we're going to look at the diffusion of those 2 gases, both at the lungs and at the muscles. So the first thing then, the percentages of oxygen and CO2 that we would find in inspired and expired air. So this table pretty much gives you the information you need. I've put in small font the nitrogen and the water vapour values just to give you that data. You will not need to learn that for this specification. But basically this is 100% of the air. These are the components that make up air that we breathe in. This is the atmospheric air, and this would be our 100%. 21% of our air is made up of oxygen, and 0.04% of air is made up of carbon dioxide. So the atmospheric air, this is the construction of it. These are the components, or this is the composition of the air that we breathe in from the atmosphere. Obviously, it's rich in oxygen and it doesn't really have much in the way of CO2. We don't want to breathe CO2 into our body. We want to breathe oxygen into our body. Okay, so inhaled air, you need to learn, contains 21% oxygen and 0.04% CO2. Similarly, you need to learn that the air that we breathe out, and these values would be at rest. So normally, the air that we breathe out contains 16% of O2 and 4% of CO2. So the number of oxygen has gone down and the number for CO2 has gone up, and actually water vapour has gone up because we breathe out moisture. But you need to learn the CO2 and the O2 values. So we breathe in lots of oxygen, we breathe out less. We breathe in barely any CO2, we breathe out more. This right-hand column really just calculates the difference between these 2 values. So 21 minus 16 is 5. And importantly, you need to recognise that whilst this is the sort of numerical difference between these 2 values, breathed in and breathed out, this percentage, so this 5%, that hasn't been breathed out, represents the amount of oxygen that our body, or for our purposes, our muscles, has used to make energy. So at rest, we breathe in 21%, we use 5% to make energy, and we breathe out the 16% we haven't used. At rest, we breathe in hardly any CO2. We do not wish to get CO2 into our body, but there's a little bit in the atmospheric air. So we breathe a little bit, 0.04% in. We breathe 4% out, which means there's more CO2 breathed out, nearly 4, so 3.96% more CO2 breathed out than we breathed in. Why is there that difference? Because when our muscles make energy and use oxygen, one of the waste products of that process is CO2. So the more we use oxygen, the more CO2 we produce, hence the difference in the values. Okay, so simply speaking, learn these numbers, but better still, understand why they're different, what this difference means. This percentage represents oxygen used by the muscles, 5% at rest. This value represents the extra CO2 that we breathe out that has been produced by our muscles when we make energy aerobically. Obviously, these values during exercise would be different again. So this is a constant value. Inhaled air, the value does not change in terms of 21%. It is a constant value. We breathe in oxygen each breath we take from the atmosphere. This value does not change unless we go to altitude, and then it would decrease. But for our purposes, this is a constant value. This is a constant value. We don't breathe in any more or any less CO2 unless the environmental atmosphere changes. These are constants. These, however, for exercise would change. So we breathe in 21%, we're exercising. That means our muscles are going to be using more oxygen than they were at rest to make energy. So they're using more oxygen. Now, if we're using more oxygen, we're going to breathe out less. So this number would go down in exercise. So let's say hypothetically we're exercising, we're inhaling 21% oxygen in the air that we're breathing in, but we're using more oxygen in the muscles to make energy aerobically. Therefore, if we're using more oxygen at the muscles, we're going to be breathing out less. So let's say this value goes down to 12%. We breathe out 12%. So we've now got a difference of 21 minus 12 is 9. So the difference now would become 9. Again, we've used more oxygen. Remember, this difference accounts for the oxygen that our muscles have used. At rest, we used 5% of the oxygen that we breathed in and we breathed out the rest. In exercise, we're using more oxygen and breathing out less, so this number would go down. So in my example, I said that went down to 12, didn't I? Same would apply to carbon dioxide. So the amount we breathe in is constant. We do not want to breathe in CO2. But if we are exercising, we are going to be producing more CO2 at our muscles. So it's really important you appreciate that CO2 is not something we try to get in or we breathe in. It's something we produce or make in our muscles, and all we want to do with it is get it out of our body, and we want to breathe it out, exhale it. So if we were working aerobically, using oxygen to make energy, we would produce more CO2. So let's say that number went up to 8%. We would breathe out more CO2. Let's say it went up to 8%, which means this value would go up also by 4 to 7.96. The difference is greater. So we're breathing in the same amount. That's no purpose to that at all. It's just we have to breathe in a bit because it's in the atmosphere. But we're producing more at the muscles, and therefore, in exercise, in the brackets, we're breathing out more CO2. We need to get rid of it. And the difference there is nearly 7.96. All right? So mainly, you have to learn the original numbers. 21 and 0.04, they don't change at sea level. 16 and 4, learn those numbers. The other numbers I've literally just made up to try to illustrate the point of what might be different during exercise. So those are the actual numbers that you need to learn. Okay. Now before I move on, just to give you a bit of terminology, this percentage here, if you remember, represents the oxygen used by the body. And so we took in this much, we breathed out that much. This is the amount that the body has used. Another phrase for that is called oxygen uptake, or VO2. Oxygen uptake, or VO2. So at rest, we uptake, or muscles uptake, a fairly small amount of oxygen and use it. If we were to do light exercise, our muscles would uptake more oxygen to make slightly more energy. If we did more extreme exercise, our body would uptake even more oxygen to use to make energy, and our VO2 score would go up. You may have even heard of teacher's talking about VO2 max, and that's basically one of the tests that you can do to determine the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use per minute. Something like the bleep test or the Cooper 12-minute run is a VO2 max test. It's there testing how good your body is at using oxygen per minute to make energy aerobically to keep you going for a long time. Right, let's move on. So, we've talked already about our atmosphere has 4 different gases in it. Let's simplify it. So it has various gases in it. The air that is in the atmosphere outside of our body has different gases, and the total atmospheric air equates to 100%. Now, the gases that make up the atmospheric air are oxygen, nitrogen, CO2, and some water vapor. And we know already that of our 100%, 21% of it is oxygen, 0.04% of it is CO2, and then 79% is nitrogen and 0.01% is water vapor. That adds up to 100% of the content of our atmospheric air. Now, some phrasing or language you've got to become familiar with is another way of describing how much gas there is somewhere. So we can describe there being 21% oxygen in the atmosphere, but there's another way of describing that, and that's what we're going to learn now. So, atmospheric air, 100% made up of different gases. The pressure of the atmospheric air is 760 millimeters of mercury. So this is the unit of pressure, millimeters of mercury. And all these gases combine have a pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury. As a whole, as 100%, they have a pressure, a total atmospheric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury. Now, when we learn about diffusion, we will need to just talk about CO2 and oxygen only, not this total, not all of them. So what we need to know is what are the partial pressures of these individual gases, not the whole pressure, 760, but the part pressure that just represents the pressure that oxygen exerts, the relative pressure of just oxygen. And the way we do that is we say, basically, if 100% all of the atmospheric air equates to 760, and I know oxygen is 21% of that total, if 760 is the 100%, if I can calculate what 20% or 21% of it is, that's my oxygen contribution. That's my oxygen partial pressure. And that's effectively what we do. We find 21% of the whole to calculate that the partial pressure of oxygen, so we say partial pressure PO2, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is 159 millimeters of mercury. We would do the same calculation if we wanted to find out what's the partial pressure of nitrogen in the atmosphere. We would say nitrogen is 79% of the whole, and we would do that calculation. Similarly, if we wanted to know what's the partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere, we would do what is 0.04% of the whole, and we would do that calculation. So partial pressure is the relative pressure that this one gas exerts as a representation of the whole in relation to the whole. It's a posh way of saying what's the concentration of oxygen, how much oxygen is there, how much CO2 is there, what's the concentration, what's the partial pressure, is there a high partial pressure or is there a low partial pressure? Okay, so it's just a way of describing how much gas is there in that location. Right, so we're going to get into diffusion. This partial pressure information will be very relevant in a moment. I just needed you to understand what partial pressure means. It's how much of the gas is there. Okay, so gaseous exchange. We're going to go through where this occurs, and we're going to go through how this occurs, the process with which gases diffuse from one place to another. Now, you will only need to know about the gas exchange of oxygen and of CO2. So let's look at the story of oxygen. The story of oxygen starts in the atmosphere. We breathe in from our atmospheric air volumes of air, and in that air we have 21% oxygen. So the story starts in the atmosphere. We know from our anatomy the air travels down our respiratory tubes and gets to our alveoli, where gas exchange happens and the oxygen diffuses into our pulmonary capillaries, ready to be distributed around the body. Okay, so that's the route in through the respiratory system, and we have gas exchange here. So the yellow terms here is where gas exchange happens. From the capillaries then, the blood goes to the heart. The pulmonary vein takes the blood from the lungs, pulmonary, towards veins, towards the heart. It goes in the left atrium and down into the left ventricle. The left side of the heart carries oxygenated blood. Here, oxygenation of the blood has happened, and the blood is now oxygenated, goes to the heart, is ejected out of the aorta, the main artery leaving the heart. Arteries go away from the heart, veins go towards the heart, goes out through our aorta, through smaller arteries, eventually to arterioles that link to capillary beds around muscles. And between the systemic capillaries and the muscles, gas exchange happens. So the story of oxygen starts in the atmosphere, where we have lots of oxygen. We breathe in that oxygen. We breathe in the air, truthfully, but it includes the oxygen, and it goes down to the alveoli, diffuses into the blood, gets transported in the blood, diffuses from the blood to the muscle cells, where we use it to make energy. That's the story of oxygen. The story of carbon dioxide basically carries on from there, because when we use oxygen to make energy aerobically, we produce CO2. So CO2 story starts in the muscles, not in the atmosphere. It starts in the muscles. We make energy with oxygen. We produce CO2. CO2 then has to leave our muscles. We need to get rid of it. We cannot let it build up. It's bad for us. If our blood becomes too acidic, because of the carbonic acid, so CO2 is transported as carbonic acid, then we have issues. So we get rid of the CO2 from our muscles. It diffuses into the systemic capillaries, which then feed into venules and back through our veins into our main vena cava, and then goes into our right atrium, down to our right ventricle. The right side of the heart is deoxygenated blood. This blood needs to be pumped by the right ventricle back to the lungs to be topped up with oxygen, to be reoxygenated. So it goes into the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary means it's going to the lungs, and we know it's going to the lungs because it's going away from the heart. Arteries go away, and eventually it gets to the lungs, where the CO2 diffuses from our pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. We then send it via our respiratory tubes and breathe it out and get it out of our body into the atmospheric air. So the story of oxygen starts in the atmosphere, ends up in the muscles. The story of the CO2 starts in the muscles, where we produce it, and we end up breathing it out into the atmosphere. In both cases, these gases diffuse at the lungs, and diffuse at the muscles, And there's names for those two locations where gaseous exchange happens. So let's have a little look at this diagram here. So, lungs, this is the systemic circuit, so this represents where muscles are. This represents an alveolus and a pulmonary capillary going by the alveolus. Gas exchange happens here. We know oxygen moves into the blood. We know CO2 moves out of the blood into the lungs, at the lungs. This location of gaseous exchange is called external respiration. So external respiration involves the movement of these two gases at the lungs. What happens at the muscles? So Oxygenated blood arrives at the muscles and oxygen diffuses into the muscles. We produce CO2 here, and CO2 diffuses from the muscles into the blood to be taken away. This location is where internal respiration happens. So the movement of oxygen and CO2 at the muscles is called internal respiration. And it kind of makes sense. The lungs are slightly more external, nearer our outside than the muscles are. The muscles are much more deeper into our body, into the story. So external respiration is where we get air from the external environment into our blood. And here's where we get the gases in our more internal environment. Okay, so that's the two locations where gaseous exchange happens. Lungs, external, muscles, internal respiration. So now we have to look at how diffusion occurs. And in order to do that, you need to appreciate the slide. Now, if you were to go to a playground and you were to sit on a slide that was flat and level, so something like that, you were sat here, you would not move anywhere at all. If there is a balanced, angle or an even or equal angle, there's no difference between one end and the other end, you will not move at all. And that principle applies to gases also. So if there's a place where the gas, the proportion of gas, the partial pressure of, let's say, oxygen is the same in this location and the same in this location, the oxygen will not diffuse. No movement of that gas will happen. So if there's a place of equal amounts of gas or concentrations of gas, there's no gradient at all, no gas will move. That's the first principle. If there was a place where there was a slightly higher concentration or partial pressure of oxygen compared to the other location, so there's a little bit more here and a little bit less here, the oxygen would diffuse down this concentration gradient. If you were on this slide, you'd go down a bit. If there was a slide that had a steeper or bigger difference, a much higher partial pressure or concentration here, and a much lower concentration or partial pressure here, more gas would move. You would move much more rapidly, and in terms of gases, more would move as well. So it's not just the speed, it's the amount of gas that moves as well. We diffuse gases because we want to have ultimately the same amount in both places. If we've got a place where there's more in one than the other place, it will diffuse until there's the same in both. So you need to understand the principle of a concentration gradient. A concentration gradient is where there's a high or a higher amount in one location and a lower amount in another location. We'll describe these concentration gradients in terms of being shallow or being steep, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So, how does diffusion happen? Diffusion happens because, and only if, there's a place where there's a higher partial pressure of a gas, whether that's oxygen or CO2, it doesn't matter. The principle is if there's a higher amount in one place and a lower partial pressure or concentration or amount in another place, the gas will diffuse from the high to the low until equilibrium. So I'm just going to enlarge this word here, until there's equilibrium. And equilibrium means there's balance, there's equal amounts. So diffusion happens until there's equilibrium in both locations. This high to low, which was effectively my slide, a high to a low, is called a concentration gradient. And as I said, we will use the language of either having a shallow concentration gradient or a steep concentration gradient. The difference between the high and the low, if it's not very much, will be shallow. If it's a much bigger difference, then it will be called a steep gradient. Okay, so gases diffuse down a concentration gradient where there's a higher to a lower concentration or partial pressure. Just to show you the two different sizes of gradient, let's say here's a high to a low, it's a relatively shallow gradient because the high isn't much higher than the low. And if it's a shallow gradient, not much gas will need to diffuse until it's equal. This shows a steeper concentration gradient. The higher is much higher than the low, so more gas will diffuse down that gradient until it's equal. So the steepness of the gradient, the size of the difference, determines how much gas moves. Okay, but the principle behind it is things move from a high to a low pressure. Now I suggest that you pause the video and have a really close look at these two diagrams. Remember, this is external respiration at the lungs between the alveolus and the pulmonary capillary. This is internal respiration between the systemic capillary and muscle cells, muscle tissue. What I suggest you do is purely look at the partial pressure values of oxygen first. Go through these and then go through these. And then go back and do the same, but for carbon dioxide. So let's just look at the oxygen values first. So blood returning from the body to the lungs has a partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury, mmHg, that's the unit of pressure. The partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs, in the alveolus, is 100, and this is a constant value. We are always breathing in fresh air with lots of oxygen in it, therefore this value will not change. This is a constant. So we've got a high partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus, and we've got a lower partial pressure of 40 in the blood returning from the body. So we've got a high and we've got a low, and we know from our previous slide, if we've got a high and a low, diffusion will occur and the gas will move down that diffusion gradient. So what we know logically is that this is the high, this is where the blood is low in oxygen, therefore oxygen will diffuse down this gradient and go into the pulmonary capillary until equilibrium, until there's equal amounts and there's 100. So the blood leaving the lungs will have a partial pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury, because it's basically been topped up. I liken this example to a car and a petrol tank. And you come up, the lungs are the petrol station, you come to the garage and you've been driving your car around a little bit, so you've used some of your petrol, you've 40 partial pressure here. Your petrol station has always got lots of petrol that you can use, and you basically top up your petrol tank until it's full, and you'll drive off with a full tank. You drive off your car to the muscles and you use some petrol. You basically give the muscles some of your petrol. If you want to go somewhere, you've got to burn some petrol. So your blood arrives with a partial pressure of about, I know it says 95 here, but it's normally about 100. And so you've got a high partial pressure in the capillaries, and you've got a partial pressure of only 40 in the muscles, because your muscles use oxygen. So now the high is in the blood and the low is in the muscle cells. So we've got a concentration gradient, and again it's only a shallow gradient, 100 to 40. And the gas, the oxygen, therefore will diffuse down that gradient and diffuse into the muscle cells so that the muscle cells can use it. And it therefore means that the blood leaving the muscles, because you've given off some of your some of your oxygen, the blood leaving the muscles will only have a partial pressure of 40. So then we basically start the story again. The blood goes back via the heart up to the lungs, and it arrives at the lungs, partial pressure of 40, gets topped up, drops off the oxygen to be used, leaves a bit more empty, goes back up. And that's the story of oxygen. It starts here, gives some off, needs topping up again. The reverse happens of CO2. So CO2 returns to the lungs, so we've got a partial pressure of 45 in the blood returning to the lung. We've only ever got a partial pressure of 40 in the alveoli. We're always breathing CO2 out, remember, so we're always getting rid of it. This does not change. So we've got a slightly higher partial pressure here, and we've got a lower partial pressure in the alveolus. Therefore, things move high to low, and some CO2 will diffuse into the alveolus and get breathed out and expelled out of our body. So that means now we've got rid of some, and our blood leaving our lungs now has the partial pressure of 40. 40 comes down to the muscles. Remember, the muscles is where we make CO2. So we've got more CO2 in our muscles. There's a high here of 45, a low in the blood arriving at the muscles, high to low. CO2 diffuses into the blood and goes away fuller with CO2, deoxygenated. We take that CO2 to the lungs where we diffuse it out and get rid of it. We come back with less CO2, we pick up more CO2, we take it away, we get rid of it. We come back emptier of CO2, it diffuses into the blood, we take it away to get rid of it. That's the story of CO2. So it starts really here, we produce it here, we get it into the blood, and we diffuse it and breathe it out. Now at rest, these are the numbers really you need to know. 100, 40, 45. It's pretty much the numbers you need to know for partial pressure of CO2 and partial pressure of oxygen. This shows you gaseous exchange values for rest. This is for rest. If you were exercising, you would use more oxygen, so this number would go down, maybe to 20. Which means there's a steeper gradient. We've got 100 or 95 arriving, and we've got only 20 in our muscles because the muscles have taken up more, have used more. So we've got a steeper gradient. We need more oxygen to diffuse into our muscles down that steeper gradient. That makes sense. Our muscles are using more oxygen. The blood leaving our muscles would then have less oxygen in it, so this would be 20. It would arrive emptier. This would be 20, and again here we've got 100 to 20, a steeper gradient. Logically then, to fill my petrol tank up again, I've got to put in more gas. I've got to have more oxygen diffused down this steep gradient to top up my blood. So in exercise, this number would go down to 20 because you're using more oxygen at the muscles, which creates a steeper gradient here and which will create a steeper gradient here. More diffusion happens in exercise. Similarly, CO2 values we produce if we're working aerobically, we're using more oxygen, muscles are making more energy, we would produce more waste, we produce more CO2. This number would go up a bit. I don't actually have a value for that, but that value would go up, which means we've got a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide here than the 40, which makes a steeper concentration gradient, a higher to a low, and more CO2 would diffuse into the blood to be taken away. That's just logical. The more we make, the more we need to transport it away and get rid of it. So the CO2 might go up, let me hazard a guess, to something like 48. So we've got a 48 to a 40. We've got a steeper concentration gradient again, and we would diffuse more of this CO2 into the alveoli to be breathed out. That's logical. We want to get rid of it. So in both cases, in exercise, these numbers would change. These numbers remain constant all the time at sea level. We use more oxygen, this goes down. We make more CO2, this would go up. Both of those changes mean the gradient at these two locations become steeper. And we know from the previous slide, this is the shallow gradient of rest at both locations. This is the steep concentration gradient of exercise in both locations. So I've just given you this slide as a written summary, and this only shows you the diffusion gradients and the diffusion descriptions of oxygen and of CO2 at rest. Take your time, have a read through this. This is what happens at the lungs for external respiration. You may be asked about both gases in one location at the lungs. You may be asked about both gases in one location at the muscles. You may be asked about one gas at one location. So you need to make sure you interpret the questions correctly. Lastly then, just to recap, things that can help diffusion happen. The cells of the vessels, the alveoli, the capillaries, the red blood cells, all being very thin so that the gases can diffuse through these thin walls much more easily than thicker walls. Semi-permeable walls of the alveoli and the capillaries also gives a short diffusion distance collectively between them. The alveoli have a moist layer as well that also helps the diffusion. So just some factors that you need to appreciate, which we may have addressed a little bit from other respiratory systems. So lastly then, just to show you the sort of question you might come across, this question says, for 3 marks, oxygen moves from the lungs to the blood by the process of diffusion. So it gives you a bit of information. We know automatically from interpreting this question that it's about external respiration. It's happening at the lungs. Describe the process of diffusion of oxygen at the alveoli in the lungs. So it's asking purely about oxygen. This answer does not require any information about CO2 in it. It just wants to know about oxygen, and it just wants to know about external respiration at the lungs. So don't talk about muscles or CO2. Looking at the mark scheme, so oxygen concentration is high in the lungs. Better answer still is a PO2, a partial pressure of 100 in the lungs. Because it's just been inhaled. It's come from our atmosphere. There's fresh oxygen. We've got 21% oxygen in the air that we breathe in. There's a lower partial pressure in the blood, the pulmonary capillaries. Better answer, the partial pressure of oxygen in the pulmonary capillaries is 40 millimeters of mercury because some of it's been used. It's deoxygenated blood. It's been used by the muscle. Therefore, oxygen will move from the area of high concentration in the alveoli to low concentration in the blood. This is down the concentration gradient. This is a shallow concentration gradient from 100 to 40. They've offered you option to give a sense of why the process is a bit efficient as well, because it mentioned the fact that the alveoli's got a semi-permeable membrane, so it allows it to diffuse easily through it. But you do need high to low, high to low. That's the rule, high to low. So this question actually came from a previous A-level paper. So efficient respiration is an important factor for effective performance in sport. Describe the detail of gaseous exchange either at site A or B. So this came with a diagram showing the lungs or the muscles. So here's the description of gas exchange at the lungs. And because it says gas exchange and it doesn't specify a gas, it wants you to describe both. Similarly, here's the information for the muscle site. So it goes through external respiration, oxygen and CO2 at the lungs. And here's internal respiration, oxygen and CO2 at the muscles. So you can pause and have a little read through that. This version purely asked for, so the resting information, so it specifies at rest, and it just wants carbon dioxide at the lungs. So no point in talking about oxygen because the question just wants CO2. So my point to you is, be careful about what you answer. Does it want oxygen? Does it want gaseous exchange at one of the locations, which is both gases? Or does it want just one gas at a location? You need to interpret your questions.